If you want to quickly set up Firebase for your Angular app along with a completely local emulated environment for development and optionally support for unit and end-to-end tests, then strap in. We're going to have your app powered up faster than you can say. Well, not really, but it's going to be pretty quick. So our goal here is to take a newly generated Angular app and install Firebase using the Angular Fire package, create a new production project with Firebase, set up the Firebase emulators for completely local development, set up a local security rules file for Firestore, set up some configurations so that we automatically use the emulated Firebase services in development and the real services in production. And optionally, I can also show you how you can set up unit tests for your Firebase security rules and how to create end-to-end tests for an app that interacts with Firebase. So the first thing you'll need to do is install the Firebase tools with npm install-g Firebase tools. And then once you have that installed, you are going to want to run Firebase login, and you are going to need an account with Firebase to do this. And then we are going to install the Angular Fire library to help integrate Firebase with our Angular project. So let's install that with ng add Angular Fire. Now this is going to prompt you for what you want to add to your project. So what you select here will depend on what it is exactly that you want to do. But let's say for this example, I want to use a Firestore database and authentication. So I'm going to deselect hosting because I don't want that. And I'm going to select Firestore and authentication and then hit enter. So now we just need to proceed through the prompt. So I'm just going to select my account. It's going to get a list of all my existing projects. And although we are going to be developing entirely locally, we will want to deploy this as a real Firebase project eventually. So we are going to create that now. So we can just choose create new project. And let's just give this a name of subscribe to Josh. And then that's going to go ahead and create that project for us. So now it's been created, we will have that project available now. If we were to go to the Firebase console, we'd be able to see it. And within that project, we also need to create a web app if we want to use the Firebase JavaScript SDK. So we'll create new app. Again, I can just call this subscribe to Josh. Now it's going to go ahead and create that web app for us. And now that's complete. And the good thing about using the Angular Fire schematic here is that it's going to set up all of our configuration for us. So if we quickly take a look in our app module file, you'll see that we have a bunch of stuff set up in here. If I just save this to format it, we can see we've got the Firebase stuff going on in the app module. And also in our environments file, we have the configurations for our dev and prod environment. Now we are going to have to make some changes to this in a little bit, but it's nice that it sets up all these files for us automatically. So although the ng add schematic for Angular Fire does automatically do a lot of the work for us, like setting up our environment files and the imports for our root module, there are some additional things we still want to configure in our project for Firebase, like a local security rules file and emulators. So we are also going to use the standard Firebase CLI to set some things up for us. So what we're going to do now is run Firebase init, and this is going to prompt us with some more options. So again, what you select here will depend on what you want to use, but let's just follow along with the example of us wanting to use authentication and a Firestore database. So let's just try to do this now. We're going to select Firestore, and we also want to set up the emulators here as well. So let's just hit enter. We're going to use an existing project. We're going to choose the one that we just created. And you can see here that it fails because it can't create the Firestore database for us. We're going to have to go to the console and do that ourselves. So it says here, looks like you haven't used Cloud Firestore in this project before. Go to this URL to create it. So I'm just going to copy that. And now we're at the Firebase console for our actual project that we just created. And what we're going to need to do is click Create Database inside of this Firestore section here. And we're going to start that in production mode and click Next. Choose the location, click Enable. Okay, so now that has set up our Firestore database for us, and we'll actually also need to enable authentication through here as well. I'm not going to set that up right now, but you can come to this authentication section, and then you can choose what sort of sign-in methods you want to use. So you can see here we have a whole bunch of different methods we can use, and then we can just enable whichever ones we want to provide. Okay, but let's get back to our configuration for now. So we're going to try to run that Firebase init command again now. And again, we're going to choose Firestore and emulators. And this time it's already using the project we selected last time. we want to create our Firestore rules file, and we're just going to keep the default name for that, firestore.rules, and keep the default name for the indexes file as well. Most of this stuff is just going to be the default values that are suggested. We're going to set up the authentication emulator and the Firestore emulator. And again, we'll use the default ports, so port 9099 for auth emulator and 8080 for the Firestore emulator. And we will say yes to enabling the emulator UI. And what that is going to do basically is provide us an interface like we get on the console for our Firebase project, but we'll be able to see that locally, just running on localhost. And again, we can just use the default port for that, and also say yes to downloading the emulators now. So we should now have the emulators downloaded and 4 new files in our project. We have this Firebase RC file, which is just defining which project we're using, a firebase.json file, which has some of our configuration options we set up, like the ports that we want to use and the names of the files. We have this indexes file, which at least for now, we don't really need to worry about, and the Firestore rules file, which is where we can define our security rules. So we can write our security rules in this file rather than doing it through the GUI in the Firebase console, which is sort of a more, I guess, typical approach, or at least how people do it initially, is you just have your Firestore database here, and then you go to this rules section, and you can write and publish your rules in this interface. But with our setup, we can do it directly from our project, which is also going to allow us to test these more easily if we want to do that. So although you don't need to do this right now, to publish your firestore.rules file so that they are active on your production database after you make changes, you can run firebase deploy. And if you specifically want to just deploy the rules and nothing else, you can use firebase deploy only Firestore rules. However, we are still going to be able to test changes to our rules with our local emulator setup without needing to push them live all the time. So now that we have our basic project set up, it's time to configure it so that it runs completely locally using the emulators. And the first thing we're going to do is modify our development and production environment files. So first, in our production environment, which will be used when we build a production version of our app, that is to say when we use the prod flag when we're building, what we're going to do is use a use emulators property, and we are going to set that to false. Because when we are using the production version of our project, we don't want to use the emulators. And we're going to do the same thing in our development environment. But for this one, we are going to say use emulators, and we're going to set that to true. And we're also going to make another change here, and this is important. What we're going to do is change this project ID from whatever it is to demo project. So this is a special naming convention for the Firebase Emulator Suite. Any project ID that follows the format of demo-something lets the emulators know that we want to use a demo configuration and to only use emulated services, not real ones. So if you do attempt to access a non-emulated service, it should fail. Okay, so now that we have our configuration values here, we are going to go to our root module file where Firestore and authentication are being configured, and we are going to make some changes to how these are provided. So I've just pasted this in here, but I'll have the source code available in the description so that it is easy for you to get all of these imports right. But the basic idea here is that we are going to use our environment configuration to determine whether or not to use the connect emulator methods. So for example, with the auth, we check our use emulators config. So we have if environment.use emulators. And if it is true, we use the connect auth emulator method to connect to the port where we told the auth emulator to run. So rather than using the real authentication service from Firebase, we are going to use our emulated version at this address. And our Firestore setup here looks a little bit different because we have this little extra bit here as well. So in this case, if the use emulators property is true, we're actually supplying some settings for the Firestore database here, and we're using this experimental force long polling true. So this is actually only required if you want to use the end-to-end testing process I mentioned before with Cypress and Firebase. So I'm going to have a link to instructions on doing that in a separate video in the description. But otherwise, it's the same basic idea happening here as well. We just check that use emulators property. If it's true, we connect the emulator. If it's not, we just use the standard Firestore. Now, all of this requires that the emulators are actually running when we try to serve our app. So you can do that just by running Firebase emulators start, and that'll boot up the emulators for us. And then in a separate window, we can just serve our app as normal. But this is a bit tedious to do every time, having to remember to do both of those things. So we are going to look at an alternative method in just a moment. And keep in mind, you will need Java installed on your machine in order to run the emulators. So I'll link to the document from Firebase outlining versions required in the description. Okay, so let's take a quick look at what we have here. We can see that both the Auth and the Firestore emulators are running at the correct ports. And we also have the emulator UI running on port 4000. So let's take a look at that. So we can see all of the emulated services that we have available here. We can see that the authentication and the Firestore emulator are running. And if we want, we can view those services by clicking on the tabs up here. I can click on the authentication tab. I can add users and modify users. I can go to the Firestore tab and I can see any collections I have, as well as clearing all the data and creating new collections, modifying documents, all of that stuff. So all the sorts of things you would do through the standard Firebase console, you can basically just do here in your emulated environment. Except this is all just going to be fake local data. And you can also seed the emulators with pre-made data like fake collections, documents, users, and so on, so that you don't have to create data manually each time. Because otherwise, every time you boot up the emulators, you're just going to have a blank slate, which is what you might want. And so when you serve a development version of your project, it's going to use this fake emulated data and these fake services. And when you create a production build, it is going to use the real Firestore and Firebase project. So I'm going to terminate the emulators now by hitting Control-C, and I'll stop serving the application as well. And I mentioned it's a bit annoying to remember running the emulators each time you want to serve your project. So what we can do to address this is add a new script to our package.json file. So what I'm going to do is modify this start script, and instead we are going to use this. So this will execute the Firebase emulators first, and then once it is done, it will run whatever command you supply to it. So I'm using the ngserve command here, but if you're using ionic, you can use the ionic serve command if you prefer, but it does the same basic thing. It's just going to be running on a different port. So now if I just run npm start, the emulators will start up, and then once they have finished booting, my app is going to be served. So you can see now the emulators are booting up, and now we are running the ngserve command. It's generating the browser application bundles, and then it is going to serve the app. So I'm going to leave this video here, but we can take this even further. We can also set up Cypress Firebase for easier end-to-end testing with Firebase, and we can set up unit testing for our local Firestore security rules. So I have separate videos on both of these things, including specifically using a test-driven development approach to creating Firestore security rules. So I'll link to my existing videos on that if you're interested in checking that out. And I also have an entire module for Elite Ionic Pro members that walks through doing all of this and a lot more, including getting all of the tests for this running in a CI environment whilst building a real-world Firebase application with Angular and Ionic. So I'll have a link to that in the description as well if you want to check that out. Alright, that's it for this video. The emulated data might be fake, but my appreciation for you checking out my video is real. I hope you have a great day, and if you feel like leaving a like or subscribe before you go, it would be much appreciated. Okay, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.